Friday, 3rd of April, A.D. 33. Jesus is tried by the Sanhedrin and sent to Pontius Pilate, who asks him some questions and has Jesus beaten. The Sanhedrin does not relent. They demand Pilate execute him. Pilate points to the Passover tradition of pardoning a criminal and lets the mob decide Jesus' fate, and they choose to let Barabbas go free instead. Pilate washes his hands of the decision, and the mob cries out that Jesus' blood will be on their hands and the hands of their descendants. That's the story from the Gospels, but is that true? Is there really a conspiracy to kill Jesus and blame it on the Jews? The Gospel story has been used to justify Antisemitism for over 1,000 years. But is there a problem with the story? To be certain, the Sanhedrin does want Jesus dead. Jesus is challenging their claim to authority. The Sanhedrin wants people to believe that they are the only source of God's authority, the only mouthpiece for the Lord. They also want the vast sums of money worshippers send to the temple, performing sacrifices, and they like the lifestyle that they have gained with the favor of Rome. However, as previously stated, just because the Sanhedrin wants Jesus dead does not mean that the Jews want him dead. The people who benefited most from Jesus were the Jews, who had their hopes pinned to the coming Messiah. The Jews didn't like the status quo with Rome, and the Sanhedrin, Rome's lapdog, keeping them under thumb. What of Pilate? He cannot find fault in Jesus, right? Well, Pilate was a ruthless man who would find an excuse to kill Jesus if he wanted to. Pilate had no compunction killing Jews, and Jesus was just a Jew among many. Worse still, Jesus was a religious agitator. It didn't matter to Pilate if he was Messiah or not. As long as people believed he was, that could lead to a rebellion, and a rebellion would give Pilate a hard time. Pilate worked really hard, rising the ranks to become prefect, and he did everything he could to keep his job. Is it any wonder so many Messiah claimants ended up dead under his tenure? Didn't Pilate wash his hands of Jesus' death? Actually, no. That was a Jewish practice, not a pagan Roman practice. Pilate would not have washed his hands, just like he would have not been circumcised, just like he would not have abstained from eating oysters, which was a delicacy in Rome. And the Passover pardon? Actually, there is no historical account of such a tradition outside of the Gospels. Yes, a prefect did have the authority to pardon prisoners, and there are specific examples of prefects who had pardoned prisoners during Passover and at other times throughout the year. But we have no evidence of a Passover tradition of pardoning someone. It appears nowhere in the Old Testament, so it wasn't a Jewish tradition, and it appears nowhere in the Roman records, so it was not a Roman tradition. It's not in Josephus or the Talmud or in Philo. The idea of the pardon appears first in the Gospels associated with Pilate, and if we take into consideration Pilate's character, we can doubt that a bloodthirsty man such as he would have considered pardoning a Jew at Passover. Remember, Pilate's job as prefect was to keep order, and part of keeping order is not to give in to the will of the mob. When there's a mob, the prefect puts it down. He does not acquiesce to their demands. Pilate was recalled to Rome because of his brutality. not because he caved to the will of his subjects too frequently. So Pontius Pilate does not free Barabbas, and he does not wash his hands of the blood guilt, and it is not the Jews who hate Jesus, but the Sanhedrin. What in the world is going on? We have to take two things into account, namely the time the Gospels were being written and the mindset of the Gospel writers. Mark, the first written canonical Gospel, was written around AD 70, around the time of the Jewish revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple. Up until that time, there was little difference between Jewish Christians and Christian Jews. The Gospel writers wanted to distance themselves from the Jews because the Jews were being systematically destroyed by the Romans at the time. There were far more Jews than Christians, so, as a matter of survival, the Gospel writers had to make the Jews look like the enemy, and the good Roman, Pontius Pilate, look like he was reluctant to kill the Messiah. Jewish guilt was not created out of malice, but fear. Jesus' disciples hid, and Peter in particular denied him 3 times out of fear of the Romans. And it was only witnessing the resurrection that made them become fearless evangelists. The Gospel writers, living more than a generation after the resurrection, had no such miracles to boost their confidence. Out of sheer pragmatism, they altered the story of the trial of Jesus to keep Rome from lumping them in with the Jews. Saying Pontius Pilate had much more to do with the death of Jesus and exonerating the Jews does not mean what many people think it may mean. Saying the Gospel writers altered the actual events of Jesus' life go without saying. Gospel means good news, not raw fact. There's no way the Gospel writers could have known what was being said between Jesus and Pilate. Similarly, the Sermon on the Mount is way too densely packed to have been delivered as a single sermon. It's more likely a condensed version of many sermons given over many months. And John even says at the end of his gospel that he had to condense material because Jesus did so much that he couldn't fit it all in. Saying that the gospel writers were human and acted out of human motivation does not mean that Jesus was fake or that the resurrection never happened. There is enough to say that the Gospels do point toward the truth, but a finger pointing toward the moon is not the moon. It also does not mean that the Gospel writers were acting in a sinister manner. They were making the story of Jesus more accessible to a wider audience, and part of that includes maintaining the survival of the nascent movement that was Christianity in the 1st century. It is a double-edged sword. We can use the Gospels as a launching pad to grow in relationship with Christ, or we can use them to justify antisemitism. The choice ultimately is up to us, and with the knowledge of history there is hope that we can unravel the story of Jewish blood guilt and fix a wound that has festered for close to 2,000 years. Then, at last, we can put the conspiracy to kill Jesus to rest.